Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome again to another episode where we look at how we reimagine productivity. I'm sure for those of you who have followed us, you would see that the last 4 weeks have been an absolute blast as we have looked at productivity, we have examined principles, we have brought in the experts to talk to us on how we take these principles and use them in our day to day lives. It's been an exciting and an amazing time for me, and I'm sure from the feedback we have received, it's also been an amazing time for you all as well. Now, I am super excited about the guest we have this evening. But before I go there, we're live across the different channels: Facebook, YouTube, Instagram is coming up very shortly. And please do share the links, share it with your friends, and you're going to want to listen to the guest we have today. The topic is also quite an interesting one in this time of a downturn. Quite a lot of people have said, hey, what do we do? People are losing their jobs. What do we do? What are the next things we move on to? Well, we've got someone here today who is going to be helping us on that very interesting and amazing topic. So I'm not going to take much more of your time. I'm going to introduce our guest to you this evening. Dolapo Oni is a real estate investor, real estate developer. She's the CEO of Citygate Homes and Citygate Property Development Limited. And she's also the host of a podcast, Property Mom. And there they talk about different things that have to do with property, live interviews. They showcase people who are doing excellent work in that field. Her expertise is buying properties, undervalued properties, turning those properties around and raising a decent income for the property investors. So if you know people who are interested in property, reach out to them now. Tell them we've got an expert on the program when it comes to building a property portfolio. Before going into property, Dolapo worked at KPMG Consulting in the United States and BP Oil and Gas in London in the United Kingdom. And she's going to tell us how she started, what she did. And I'm sure it's going to be an amazing time as we talk to our guest this evening. Dolapo, we welcome you to the program. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you so much, Akin. It's so great to be on your platform and just going over everything that you guys have done. It's really impressive. I love the setup. Well done. Really chuffed to be on your show.
Thank you so much for being here, Dolapo. It's such an amazing thing. Now, I always ask this question when we start, and when I got to yours, to your profile, and I was reading your profile, I said to myself, how on earth does Dolapo cope with all this stuff that she does? And look, one of the things that really caught my attention, right? Managing a property portfolio, the podcast, mother, these things together. How do you do this?
Lots of sleepless nights, I assure you of that. But I must say that, support around me has been fantastic. I can't, obviously, as you can imagine, you're married, right? So you know that your partner has to really step up to fill up some of the gaps. So my husband has been really great in being supportive of, especially last year. You can imagine 2020 was a tough year for anyone who was in property, and some of the strategies that we'll talk about that really took us massive impact, in terms of income. So he understood sort of me juggling quite a number of things and really stepped into that role of helping me out in the house. Funny enough, he had to also work from home, and obviously you can imagine how that would be juggling that with juggling the kids, and I'm also juggling the kids, juggling work. So it's definitely been tough times. But when we came into 2021, I said, look, we've already gone through 2020, we've dealt with that. By now, we should be able to deal with 2021 and whatever 2021 brings, right? So we've just moved on with it.
So let me ask you this question because you've started from a very interesting point. You talked about family and the impact of your husband in trying to juggle things together. How important is that family support for someone who wants to start not just in property but in anything that they're doing? How important is it?
So I would say having it is definitely a plus. But over the last few months, I've started mentoring quite a bit. And I found really some women who find themselves in a situation where they maybe are single moms and they need to step up into that role. They also find a way to make it happen. So, I'm definitely blessed. I say that all the time that I have someone who can help me and is supportive of my goals and my dreams. And, we share and we strategize together. But I would say that if for people who are on their own, just having a support network of either friends or family that can, support that it's also possible to be successful in sort of running a new venture. I would say that when I started, I was single though, so I started this business as a single young female, and there was more time, I would say, to be able to get things moving and really put in the hard graft. So yeah, so basically, just support is the most important thing.
Oh dear. Now you're dropping some points there that are so important that I don't actually want to let that go. How difficult was it
Mhm.
starting as a young female in this sector?
So, one of the things that just to back up a little bit, is that because I had a full time job and I was, in a sense, creating what you would now call a side hustle while I was working full time. So, during my lunch hours, I would take off to go view property. In the evenings, I'd be doing research. So, all of those things I was doing. But I would say the real big step was leaving my full time job to go full time into this property investing, because that was what you would call a real faith move. Like you had to make it work because you were living behind security and going into an area where everything just had to stack up to make it work. And I don't look back for 1 second, because everything has grown. I always say that when you start off, you always have an image as to how things are going to go. But as you get into the business, you start realizing how opportunities start to open up. I talk about my first investor. Literally, I had just left work, going to view a property, and just as I came out of the station, he was coming out of like an apartment where he was staying. And so I saw him and I was like, "Oh, hi, what are you doing in town?" And he was like, "Oh, I'm on holiday. Where are you going this time of the day?" I said, "I'm going to view property." And that conversation ended up eventually evolving into my first investment, so as in my first investor, so external investor from, say, friends or family. So I would say that a lot of opportunities open up once you step out, but you have to have a very calculated plan of what I say, like how you fire your boss. You have a plan to fire your boss, because you have to know, okay, this is how I'm going to support myself. And you need to have that generally for about 1 to 2 to 3 years, ideally about 3 years. So you have three statements of accounts when you're looking for lending, because that's a very critical point that people need to be aware of, is that before you leave your security and you leave something that's giving you income, you definitely have to demonstrate to yourself and to whoever you're going to be um, obtaining lending from, that you have at least 2 years of annual accounts to demonstrate to access funding. Because otherwise, you're just dead on arrival. You just won't be able to raise any funding, and that's going to impact your business.
All right, so let me start from this basic point, and that's the
Mhm.
fact that uh, the world is going through this pandemic. We're now at this stage where, like I was saying at the beginning, people are losing their jobs, companies are shutting down. I mean, if you just look at the hospitality sector and the number
Mm.
of these places that are shut, is property really still a good thing to look at this point in time?
Yeah, so that is a good question, because one of the things that happened last year that really impacted, so you can imagine, property and hospitality, there's a bit of a link between them. So if you think about one of the primary strategies that I employed was once I bought a property, I would put it on the market for a short-term rental. So things like short-term accommodation for people who are coming on holiday or people that are coming for business. So once the lockdown was announced, I was like, oh my God, like literally you could just see the writing on the wall. That business completely came to a screeching halt. I remember watching, as I think it was Donald Trump that was making the announcement that they were shutting the borders from America into UK, and that's it just cascaded from Nigeria. And so think about most of our clients that are feeding that part of the business are coming in from America, coming in from from Nigeria. And so once all of that happened, it just brought a big freeze on that side of the business. Now the rest, there was that initial, during the lockdown where there was a bit of a panic. So there was also on the mortgage side. So because we also do acquisitions where we buy property, I buy mainly in auction, refurbish, put it back on the market, either to sell or to rent out. Literally, one of the mortgage brokers that I was working with, who had a lender on the back end that was supposed to be lending to a project, just pulled out. Just pulled out once the lockdown was announced. Said they couldn't cope, and you can imagine that lives are dependent on these funding. So I say always with property, you should have a backup plan. You should never rely on just one source because anything can happen in the market. That all that being said, property is still a very viable way of creating wealth. And I would say, and I have something in my website that talks about the pandemic guide to property investing, where it's just important for you to understand when you're buying a property that you've locked in value from the onset, i.e., you've bought at either a discount or you can see a way to uplift that property value, and that you're going to hold it in the long term. Because if you hold the property in the long term, then you weather most of the storms that will then come through.
So you've talked about the fact that obviously you have some sort of 1 year, 2 year, 3 year plan, but what are some of the challenges that you would say you went through when you were making that switch, that someone else who may be listening, watching this video after this would say, I find myself in this position. What exactly should I do? How do I overcome that challenge? What would you say?
Okay, so the reason why I mentioned that about the 1 and the 2 year, making sure you have 2 years worth of accounts that you can demonstrate to lending, is that's exactly what I discovered in my second year. So I always say my first year was actually pretty smooth sailing. Getting mortgages and getting access to funding wasn't difficult because I had um, proven source of funds leading up to it. But the second year then turned out to be a tough year because at this point I only had 1 year set of accounts, and a lot of lenders weren't looking at people at the time that only had 1 year set of accounts. So I always say make sure you have at least 2 years before you quit your job. So at least that guarantees you that you always be able to get funding. Not to say they're not lenders, it's just that it's more difficult. But the most critical, I would say, before you leave your job is that you have an ongoing, steady stream of income. So what does that mean? It means that when you think about property investing, at least when I thought about property investing, I thought about it as going in, getting funds, buying a property undervalued, doing up the property, putting back on the market to sell. And I had done that about 3 times before I actually quit my job. And it was the last one. I think I pretty much matched my salary. And I thought, why am I bothering going to work when I enjoy this process so much? And I'm kind of needing to juggle it with work. So I then thought, okay, what I would do is I would sell properties, and based on the proceeds from my sale, I'll keep some aside and continue to invest the rest, keep some aside and continue investing. Now, in theory, that sounds like it's plausible. But in practice, what happens is usually, I don't know why, and a lot of developers will say this, I call it the developer's dilemma, where you will find yourself in a project and somehow that project will just take much more funds than you initially anticipated. So I think it was about my fourth or fifth deal when I was waiting for a seller. And remember, at the time when I got into property investing, similar times to now, but very different in that there was lots of properties to buy, but there were no buyers in the market. So there were those of us that were buying and were getting good deals. But then when it turned around to try and sell those properties, then there were limited buyers that were on the market to buy those properties, which then meant that I had these properties lying around for like more months than I would want to. So maybe I'd estimated about 6 months, and then would now be going to 7 months, 8 months. You can imagine the panic. Or I would have gotten I would have gotten an offer, and then the offer would fall through. So just making sure that you have another source of income, and I will come to that about how you create some of these different strategies within property, which I then discovered can then supplement your income.
I want to press you on that a little bit because that first that first property, that first one that you went out there and you said that's the one. What did you look at? What was it that you saw that said, this is the one I'm going to invest in, right? And also, how did you know that this one I'm going to spend some money here and I'm not going to overspend? I'm not going to get myself into that scenario you mentioned of maybe you buy the property for, hey, 50,000, and suddenly you find out 50,000 down the line you open one cupboard and you find this big hole that you need to
Exactly.
plug.
Money pit. Exactly. Yeah. So I would say that the way I actually got into property is so I have two stories on this point, because the way I actually got into property was with a joint venture. So I always say with people that want to invest down south, especially London, or even if you're going to go up north where properties are cheaper, that you want to always if you don't have the funds, then you don't need to just sit down and be like, okay, you know what, this is all done until I can save the funds. You can find people that have the same interests as you and develop and start to cultivate those relationships. And these it doesn't have to be people that you've known forever. It could be friends of friends. It could just you just have to have a basis of trust for each other, which you develop over time. Maybe do a few small things together and then realize whether you can work together, and then you can upscale into buying property together as a joint venture. So that's how I got my first property, was with a friend. We weren't that close when we started, but now we're best of buddies. But at the time when we started developing that relationship and we found a property and we thought, you know what, it was just at the point of the crash in 2008, and we both decided, you know what, this is a good deal. It's not a bad price. We had actually put in a cheeky offer, which was rejected. But then I guess the investors, they were based abroad, and when they started hearing about all of the bad news about the crash, financial crisis, banks falling left and right, they just decided, you know what, we want to sell this property. These girls seem like they're serious. We're just going to accept the offer, and that's how we got a pretty good deal on that. So that's my first deal, but that was with a friend. Now, my first real deal that I went into auction, and I was there actually to just buy a different property. And this property came on, and literally, I'm sitting in the auction looking at the price, and I'm like, this is not happening. So I had gone the year before to go with a friend of mine to go see his own property that he had just bought in the same block. He'd spent almost £200,000 on that property, stunning property. Now I'm sitting in an auction, and of course, remember, there's lots of repossessions, things going on. And so auctions were filled. I say that the experience I'm having now with property auctions is the exact opposite of the experience that was then. Then you could buy properties for a song. Properties just flooded the market. This property is now selling, like literally, the gavel is going down on like 100K. So I already instantly know there's at least 90 to like 80 to 90,000 pounds equity in the property, because there was completely nothing wrong with the property. It's just that they were selling it and there was nobody in the auction there to buy it. And so I just put up my hand, like literally, what's the worst that can happen? It's a flat, it's a new build, it's obviously been repossessed. Worst case, the tenants have come and trashed the place. It's going to cost me £20,000 to do it up. It's still nowhere near the price my friend paid. So that was the rationale that I used to buy the property. And it turned out to be, I still own the asset, because literally as I walked in, nothing was wrong with the property. It was still brand new. They literally must have taken it from a person, must have never rented that property. And I just put it back on the market like that. And then that was it. So that's how I got
How
started.
do we get such big breaks?
I know I've not had such a break since then, to be honest. But just being in the right place at the right time. So yeah.
That is such an amazing story. Now let me check this. You talked about going into the deal, your first one, with a friend.
Mhm.
Did you do any checks to make sure that you were not going to run into issues with this friend? I've had so many stories of people who say, well, I wanted to invest with a friend. And the reason is this: I think it's
Mhm.
key that, given what is going on in the market today, that maybe some people should start to band together as a group of sorts to go out there,
Absolutely.
buy something together, rather than trying to do it alone. How did you evaluate this particular friend to
Mhm.
make your decision that it was going to be a good partnership?
And that is a valid question because, one of the things that you don't want to get into is where you find that you just don't gel. So I think it's in stages, and that's why I said you want to start, kind of small and just work your way up. So you want to have conversations. So the way it worked with me, and in fact, there's somebody else that we've kind of been cultivating the same relationship, and we're going to do deals together. And now I'm more comfortable if she brings a deal, we'll do the deal together because we've been talking over the past year, literally just sharing ideas, sharing our thoughts. We talk about different scenarios. We assess each other based on, say, our responses to maybe other people that annoy us. So you want to get an idea, holistic idea of how does this person relate with other people? Because to be honest, the deal is the least of your problems. The real issue is the interpersonal relationship, how you resolve issues. And you'll know that just on the basis of the person themselves. So this, my friend that I said, we had met through a mutual friend. And I say the good thing about not dealing directly with close friends, which you can do business with close friends, and I do business with close friends now. But the thing with friends who are friends of friends is that there's a certain level of respect you have for each other because you don't know each other too well, so you don't take each other for granted. I think sometimes with close allies, you can tend to take each other for granted, and that's very important that you iron those out before you go into a deal. If you're going to go in with very close friends, that you understand your roles and responsibilities within that. You have conflict resolution. What's going to happen best case scenario? What's going to happen worst case scenario? Because if you make a lot of money, you can run into troubles. Just like if you run into problems where you make losses. So you want to have those kind of worst case, best case scenarios that you've analyzed with your whoever it is you're going to go with, and it could be multiple. You can have up to 4 people on the deed, and basically you just sorry on the title, and you can literally just have that conversation and say, look, this person is going to be the lead person, who's going to be project manager, person probably the person that has the most expertise, and then everybody kind of has their roles. Whoever's going to be taking care of the accounts, whoever's going to be taking care of the property, So just make sure you have very clearly defined roles and what the worst case and the best case scenarios within the deals that you're going to be in. Or watch the person's character. Make sure that you both align in terms of values and in terms of the way you resolve issues. You need to work that out. Make sure that, we had been through like a couple of things together. So I already knew how we were going to resolve some of those things, some of those issues if we ever ran into it, which we did, by the way.
Okay.
But we were able to, yeah, overcome them.
To overcome those. All right. So let me go to the big question. I keep seeing these things on social media where they say, hey, you don't need money, get into the property business or property, build your property portfolio. You don't need money. Is that true? Does it work?
It sounds too good to be true, right? And I would say one thing, it's that with property, you either have the funds or you know someone that has the funds, or you can be creative somewhere down the line. So there are three different entry routes, I would say, into property. And either you have the money, and I always say that if you have funds, then you really don't need to socialize, or you may want to socialize with and make and build relationships and network with agents and sources who are going to be bringing you the deals. But if you have the money, then you're less so inclined to need to build other alliances. Now, there's somewhere in the middle where you can take control of a property. So there's number one, there's ownership. Number two, there's controlling a property, and control. There are different control strategies. One is a simple one that's very popular is where you rent the property. So one of the strategies that I eventually ended up employing, that was my secondary strategy in property, was renting the property from a landlord or an agent, then turning around and renting that out and making money on the differential. So it's called rent to rent. Very popular strategy, and was really, really picking up until the lockdown. So still a very viable strategy where you rent the property, then you rent it out to somebody else, either on a short-term basis or long-term basis, and you make your differential. And you can imagine if you're making about 300, 400, 500 pounds per property, then you just need to build up that portfolio. So that's how you would build one portfolio, and that's where you say the controlled or the managed property portfolio. And then, of course, the last one, which is presumably the most difficult, but if you can build your networks, I don't know if you've heard the term your network, your net worth, or your network is your network.
Yeah.
Basically, you build on the contacts that you have. And like I said, when I talked about my first ever investor, it was a contact that I knew through a mutual friend. So what you want to do is when you don't have the funds, and this is a lot of the strategies that talk about, you don't have to have the funds, i.e., your own funds to get started, is because you're leveraging off your contact. Either you're getting funds from somebody else or you are leveraging off a property. There's strategies that involve where, imagine there's somebody who has a property, he wants to get rid of the property, he doesn't have the money to refurbish the property, but you know that that property is worth, let's say it's worth 400,000. The guy is happy to part with the property at say 350. And so all you have to do is to pretty much broker a deal with him at 350, get control of the property, do it up, and then you can sell it back on into the market at 450, at 400. Now, let's say it costs you 15,000 to do the works, and that's 35,000 that you just made for just brokering. Obviously the numbers are slightly simplified, but just get the idea. Some of these strategies really is about being creative between connecting people, and you sit in the middle. And so when they say things like, you can make money from property, one of the crucial elements to understand is that you are matching people that need property with people that have property. And another strategy that I will quickly talk about is the service accommodation strategy. When service accommodation was really booming, another way you could make a lot of money from it is where you matched people who are traveling into a state or into a country or wherever, and you just found people that had properties that you would just match them into, right? So you're just making money off the difference between what they're willing to pay you and the difference that you pay that landlord. So, there are all these different strategies that get you in really operating in the property space. But more importantly, you're building connections within the property space. You then know a lot of agents. You then know a lot of investors. You start talking to property owners. So it's when you're in that space that you start seeing opportunities, right?
Hmm.
And some people have really been able to leverage those opportunities to build their portfolio.
So let me ask you this. Um, have you had any horror stories, right, where you thought this was going to be a good deal and it turned out not so good on that one?
Yeah, so you can imagine that generally happens, but I must say that I am a very, very cautious investor. And I'm even more cautious when I'm dealing with other people's funds, right? So and I'm happy to say that at least when I'm taking anyone's funds, good thing is that property market has been in that direction, has just been literally in an upward incline. So I've never not returned somebody's funds because they've invested. We may not have made the huge estimates. You know how it is where sometimes you do the deal, you have this optimistic view, which that has changed, by the way. I've become rather pessimistic when it comes to analyzing deals now. But at the beginning, I tended to be, we're going to get these, we're going to get this. And then we may not quite make those estimates, but in the end, we still made pretty decent returns. I may be knocking myself down, but I've never returned anything less than 12%. So, pretty much it's about you really understanding your market, understanding the investment, and before you start going to get funds from other people. So, but to answer the question, so I would say that not necessarily on the investment side, most of my investments have been quite successful, thankfully. I would say though, on the rental side, I've had some. In fact, I'm going through one literally right now, where you just run into all sorts of people. So one of the properties I was trying out, he moved in, he was fine. Then he just stopped paying rent, and then I couldn't get him to pay the rent. I called him, and he just wouldn't pick up the phone. Eventually, he ended up. I couldn't get him. Like literally, I couldn't get a hold of him. And then when I finally got to the house and saw a woman, he moved in there as a single person. When I went there, I saw a woman with a baby, and she said, "Oh, he's in jail."
Oh
And
dear.
exactly, and then the whole thing just degenerated. Before I knew it, I checked online. He had been put in jail for manslaughter, just a whole mess.
Ooh.
But eventually, we were able to get him out. But I lost £5,000 on that. So
Oh
so yeah,
wow.
yeah, it's definitely been.
Okay, so let me ask you this then. So you get the property, you eventually put some money in, you've bought it off auction or however you got the property,
Mhm.
and you then need to hit this refurbishment and all those kind of things. How do you manage that side without really getting into now the costs are really running away from you? How
Mhm.
do you manage that?
I love that question.
particularly when you started, right? Not
But
now,
that's
not
the point. It's
now,
true because now I
when
see
you
them
started.
too. But this is what I would say. Like, so I give kudos start of buying houses because honestly, that is a super. Like I said, I'm very cautious. So I always tell investors, start with a flat because the exposure you have on refurbishing a flat is way lower than an exposure you have when you start off with a house. So unless you're really getting a house at a really fantastic deal, or maybe it's a house that's further up north and it's just going to be a quick, simple refurb, which I'm sorry, with houses, especially if it's your first one, it may not be a quick, simple refurb. You can literally open up the floorboards and find that it's rotted underneath and there's foundational problems, and that's just going to suck up all of your funds. So I personally, cautiously, would say that if you were going to get started with refurbishment, you want to get your feet wet with the flat, go through that process, understand how you work with builders, understand how they can try to shaft you, and how they will try to tell you one price at the beginning and change prices as you go along, and just get through that process first on a simple flat, where you make some money off of it. Then once you've been through that process, then you can start buying houses. Some people would disagree with me, but that I would say is a cautious approach, because once you get into houses, then you have roof issues, you have structural issues, so many different issues with the house that you really don't want to be dabbling into unless you secured yourself a rock solid builder. So because I buy in auction, when I started, I used to pay the money to get surveyors. I would literally call all the surveyors in an area and try and get the cheapest surveyor that will come out to look at the property to help me to assess whether there was anything that I should be wary about. So if you're going to be buying any properties, whether in auction or on the market, you want to spend some of this money because it's going to save you down the line, because you don't want to be saving £700, or maybe, like some of those guys, I was able to get them to come out at maybe £200, £250 just to come and look at the property and just give me a verbal assessment and say, this property is standing, it's fine. You don't want to be scrimping on that just to find out down the line that you're going to end up spending £5,000 to fix something that you could easily have at least estimated into the costs, right? So, it still does happen, but it's just about being very cautious and being very careful when you're doing your deal analysis on the front end.
There's a question I get asked a lot, and I have the question too, and that is, do I start with residential or commercial properties? What do you recommend people do there?
So I guess in it depends on your expertise, where you're coming from. So some guys I know, they're already, say, commercial surveyors, they already understand the commercial, can delve straight into it. But I would say for most average people, residential, even though it's becoming an increasingly more saturated market, is still an easier way to get your mind around it. Unless you go for some really high tech training where you're going to get like joint venture support. Because I will tell you this for free, which is that if you're going to employ a strategy that you've never done before in property, you should either start off with a joint venture or a mentor or somebody who's going to literally handhold you through it. You don't want to be spending these types of sums of money but not have somebody, like we're talking about somebody who will cost you maybe £5,000 or £10,000 to put you through, who will save you £30,000 down the line, right? So you need to be very, very conscious about when you're making these decisions. Yes, you're trying to save money because you're trying to, maybe save up and make sure you get the right deal, but you also have to be very careful that the deal itself might end up costing you way more than you anticipated. So it's very important when you're assessing that you want to start off, in my opinion, with residential. Get your feet wet. Residential concepts are pretty simple. Most people have rented a property at least at one point in their life, so they understand how rental works. Most people at least have an idea of how you change a bathroom, how you change tiles, those types of things. By the time you start getting into commercial, some of those deals can be quite complex. Obviously, you get professionals to do a lot of the legwork for you, but it's important that when you're in the room, that you're not completely blindsided by all the conversation that's going on. So if the architects are talking, structural engineers are talking, the commercial evaluators are talking, everybody's talking, and you're just there like completely lost. It's not a good place to be when you're doing a property deal. I would say start with residential where you have a bit of an idea of what's going on, then you evolve into commercial. But some people jump, like they literally do mentorship and go straight into commercial. But it's down to the person and their risk appetite as well.
Okay, let me touch on the bit on, get the training. Again, this is another area because some people like I said earlier, you hear this thing that, oh, you can easily get on that property ladder. But you're talking about these training programs that people can, maybe go on, get more information about this particular area. And
Mhm.
you have adopted, like you said, this more cautious approach to getting into property. I want to, if you can talk a little bit more on that kind of training thing, because I know you do some things in that area as well when it comes to providing resources. Do you want to talk to that a little bit?
Yeah, so it's a good thing to definitely get education. There's been something I've been hearing a lot over the last year, which I didn't hear ever before, and it was you don't know what you don't know, right? And I remember one of my first deals. I think about that particular deal, and I think of what I know now, and I think of how I could have structured that deal differently in terms of the way I laid out the property, in terms of the way I would have added more value to that property. So truly, when you're getting to some of these strategies, you actually have no idea what you're doing. You think you do until you start. So I always say that, and it's just even in the little things. I talk to people who are, maybe they want some advice and they just want to go straight and do it. And by the time they start analyzing what they're going to do, I can tell them very quickly, you'll be fine, but you've just lost so much money you didn't need to by not consulting with somebody who could have just seen. Because a lot of times we've walked the walk, we know where the potential minefields are. One very quick example is I know somebody was trying to buy an auction. And, I've told him before, I said, come to me, make sure you get the training, whatever you need. But, he's my friend, so it's fine. So he now calls me up and it's like, oh, I'm going to buy this property. It's really great. It's a fantastic price. And I said, okay, bring the deal. Let me see. And just as I said, how many years is left? He said, oh, it's 99 years on the lease. I said, are you sure? This price is really good. And truly, when I checked it out, it was 99 years from, say, 1945. Do you understand? Which means it's only actually
Oh,
30 years left on the list or something ridiculous like that. So that's a simple example. That's the kind of thing that if you're not looking, you've never been down this road, you're literally just, you are flying blind. You are literally, especially with property where there's so many costs that can just literally eat at your profits. Now, like one developer said very well, one of the seasoned developers, he said, the thing that has always offset people and has saved people, and which a lot of my developer friends have attested to, is that because the market was on an upward incline, it didn't matter what mistakes you made. I remember one of my friends made a 20% mistake. It didn't matter
whoa.
because at the end, she'd made 40% of the deal anyway. It's still her best deal till today, right? So it didn't matter because the market was on an upward incline. I don't think the market is going to be quite as steep. First of all, there are many more players in the market. Um, which actually does mean that property prices will hold up, but I don't think that the spike will be as high as what we saw coming from 2010 till now. So a steady, maybe steady incline or flat, meaning that if you make any mistakes, then you're going to feel the loss at the back end of the deal. So it's just being very careful about when you're investing and how you assess a deal, especially going in and getting training to make sure you fully understand all the ramifications. We're talking about legal. There's so many aspects, just the structural side of it, the legal side of it, even just the financial aspect, the analysis, putting the deal together. There's so many ways that it can fall apart. So
Let me do this, Dolapo. Let's take a quick break with some announcements, and then we come back and talk about your podcast and some of the resources that you have available to help people learn from this. Now, you've called it Property Mom. I'm coming to that in a minute because clearly there are some dads who want properties, but we'll come to that in a minute. Let's take this break and we'll be back. Thank you for being there and staying with us on the program. We are speaking to Dolapo Oni, the CEO of Citygate Homes, and we're going to touch on that a little bit. But Dolapo, the podcast that you do, what inspired you to start that?
Yeah, I love that. So the name is Property Mom, and it was one day I'd literally been going for a training, just at the turn of the 2020. I said, you know what, I should go on training just to find out more about how to generally just give presentations and talk about what I do and that kind of thing. And on my way back, I was actually with my parents. They were driving me back, and I said, you know what? I think I'm going to start a podcast. I'm going to start a podcast called Property Mom because those are the two things that are really like driving me nuts. Like they literally pull out my hair. My kids on the one hand and the property business on the other hand. So I decided, you know what, I'd just start off with Property Mom where we talk about, it's mainly focused on property to be fair, and property investing, how you get started. One of my key podcast that I started out with was how you get started in property without funds. And I laid out these different strategies all over the place, like starting from digital strategies all the way to investing strategies that you could get into and get your feet wet in property investing. And then kind of evolved over into then having interviews with a focus on sometimes women, but definitely quite a lot of guys as well, who are doing different things in property. And in October, for the British Black History Month, I then wanted to showcase Black women and what they were doing in this space, and met some amazing women that are really dominating in property and got into property. Also a lot of people have that same journey where they evolved from working full time, saved up, and then kind of went straight into creating their own businesses and haven't looked back. So, I cover quite a lot of investors and a lot of women who have kind of crafted a way for themselves in property. I also talk to people who started from zero. So one of my good friends, literally, that's how she got started in property, literally with no startup capital, nothing, and she's been able to get her feet wet to having a good business out of it. So we just talk about different things, talk about strategies. I don't do as much as I would, it's just I have the kids. It's difficult to manage the kids, manage family life, and still be able to put out the podcast as often as I would like to. But even within that, there's still good, rich content on there. And then, in terms of training, that's also on there as well.
Okay, so you train people on doing all this kind of stuff that you've talked about here today.
Yeah, so remember what I was saying about how it makes sense to get the education before you go in. So, one thing that I did want to do with my training was I wanted it to be, learn and do. So, I have everything I do is all about earn as you learn. Even with my investors, I've started this thing where I call it the earn as you learn. So, you invest a set of funds, but then rather than just leave it and it's passively doing work, to be fair, if you want it passively working, that's fine. But some investors really want to know what's going on. So I have investor days. We'll talk about the project, talk about how I came up with the numbers. We talk about that and they learn that way. But then for those that don't necessarily have the funds but want to get into property, then I talk about these other strategies like the rent-to-rent strategies, how you can get started, how you can leverage off your network. If you are that passionate about property, which you have to be a lot of times to employ some of these strategies, how you can start to build a business around it, start reaching out to your contacts. One key fact is that a lot of people invest with people that they know, because with property, a lot of times you're dealing with an asset that's valued at hundreds of thousands, or you're dealing with funds that's valued at hundreds of thousands. And a lot of people, it's not that they couldn't go to some third party person to go and put like their 100 grand investment with, but they would rather invest with people that they have access to. So if you can demonstrate some proficiency, then you'll be surprised at how much is really around you. And that's what I discovered when I started, that a lot of people, I don't necessarily need to go seeking for funds unless I'm in a situation where I have to. A lot of times I get funds from either family or friends or people who just want to, they know that their money is earning zero right now, so why not put it into a project and earn a decent return? So another way. So a lot of times I tell people, if you want to know more about property, just reach out to me. I'm always happy to have that conversation, and we'll decide. I always talk about, what is your stumbling block? Is it money? There are ways around it. Is it time? There are ways around it. Is it knowledge? We can figure that out, right? So there's always some way to overcome it. But I will talk about one that I'm really proud of that we're launching soon. So.
Do you want to go for that now? Go ahead.
Oh, fine, sorry. Okay.
Go
So
ahead.
basically, things that I did realize in my work was a lot of people, and I discovered this actually last year when I really got into mentoring, and was that a lot of times, and a lot of people say this, is that yes, you have the understanding, and then you go out and you practice that. But what I did discover is sometimes you can actually close the deal, but then the person on the other side of the deal is just uncomfortable because you don't have, maybe they just worry that you're new, you don't have enough experience. So what I started doing was joint venturing, and it started just as a test pilot where I joint ventured with one of my mentors, and that deal went quite well. And so I decided just at the start of the year to put together something like that. So, but it's really for people who really want to get into property, who don't really have funds to get started. And that idea was really about helping people understand how they can go out there, get property, but I can also work with them to find their clients. And then we have a joint venture arrangement on the back end. So that's what I'm launching. I'm launching with just with the first test pilot with 5 women, and it's been very popular. We're meeting for the first time in the middle of this week, and we're going to really talk about how we then strategize and move forward. And from then on, we'll build it up. So that's coming through, and you'll hear more about that as we come to market.
One question for you here, as someone maybe who's just started a few properties, just getting on this property ladder.
Mhm.
What kind of government incentives would you say are there to help those kind of people that they may want to take advantage of, right?
Okay.
Not people who are kind of well established in it, but for people who may say, yep, I'm just about to start, are there government initiatives that these people can take advantage of?
Okay, so we need to separate the difference between an investor versus somebody who's buying their home. So for investors, not really. In fact, I think that the government is more punitive when it comes to investors in property, especially. There's a couple of the more recent regulations that they've rolled out. But for people who want to buy their own homes, yes, there are government incentives like help to buy, the share scheme, all these different types of schemes that exist, where you only need to find 5% of the deposit, and then the government partners with you to then fill out and pay up the rest of the deposit to the developer, and then you have access to the property. So that is a very simple scheme that you can apply for, and it's based on it's a case by case. They will assess how much you're earning, they'll assess the value of the property, and it has to be a property that a developer has signed up to the help to buy. So help to buy is definitely a good scheme for someone who wants to buy their own home. So there's schemes out there that are to support people actually getting on the property ladder. But for investors, not quite. Yeah, more
there's
and
an
more.
there's another question I have here. And this one I'm going to put it straight to you anyway, and this is the fact that you deal with foreign investors sometimes. um, One is, what are the safeguards against this inflow of money from certain places where people may say, well, where did that money come from? You're investing in foreign properties. That's the first thing. And then the second one I want to add to that question is, how difficult is it for someone who is in maybe the US, Africa, who want to come into the UK and buy property in the UK? Because you do some work in that area. How difficult is it for those kind of people?
Yeah. And this is why I love property, right? Because honestly, you see, we've talked about all the different, if you have money, you can. If you don't, you can. If you have somewhere in the middle, so there are different strategies. And for overseas investors, I would say that there are countries, most of the, say, more established countries, the US, Canada, getting access to funding in the UK is actually not as difficult as you would think. There are different products. They're not obviously as many as there are if you were local, or if you're a domestic person looking to buy indigenous a property in London. But if you're buying overseas, there are products out there that are suited to overseas investors, and they're pretty decent rates. I would say that there are some countries that obviously are handpicked, in which it's more difficult to get access to funding, but it's not impossible. And there are actually different products out there that are suited to some of these countries. So a good example is where I'm from, Nigeria. You will find that most lenders will not lend to people who want to invest from Nigeria, but there are specialist lenders that understand the Nigerian market, have a local presence, or not even a local, maybe they'll have like a local company that vets your funding locally and all of that. And as long as you have very clear statements accounts, or you work for a multinational or a reputable company, then access to funding is actually not terrible. It's not difficult to get, to be honest. The only thing is that there is a minimum requirement. So for a lot of them, you're starting from a £300,000 minimum investment before they will even look at the investment. But then, there are all sorts of other lenders out there. One of the things that we do is that we sometimes will partner with, depending on what the outcome is, sometimes we'll partner with some investors who maybe they have like 50K, which may not be enough sometimes to get on the ladder as an overseas investor, because some of these mortgage lenders will find it a waste of time to be lending maybe another so you can buy. Not to say they don't exist, it's just that they're more difficult to come by. But then we can always work out arrangements around how you can invest and still make a decent return, based on what your situation is and what your budget is. So just to say that it's really a case by case, and it's when I start assessing that I can say, okay, this is who I'm going to direct this person to. This is the broker that can help. And
All
yeah.
right. In terms of where the market is today, right?
Mhm.
Like we said earlier, we've got the pandemic and all of that. Um, if you know what you know today about property, and you were just about to start, would you still have made that jump?
That's an interesting question, actually, and I'm not sure I've considered it. So I feel like every time is always a good time to buy property, right? But that I'm biased, right? Because I've always had good experience. But I would say one thing is that in a market that's uncertain, there's some strategies that still work. So the buy and hold, as long as you buy and you have a long-term outlook, I had figured it out, I think, somewhere mid career. This is even before I had gone for any training. That one key thing that can tide you through any storm is that there's enough of a disparity between your rental amount, i.e., the amount that you're getting paid as rent, and your mortgage, whatever you're paying as your mortgage. As long as there's a healthy difference between those two amounts, then you can weather most storms, right? Because that means you've had that property for a while. So even if your tenant decides to abandon you and doesn't pay for a few months, you've been able to save up to be able to tide through a difficult season. And if you have a tenant who's still paying, but your property goes into negative equity, let's say you bought it at a certain amount, property prices have now completely crashed. But mortgage prices don't change. Like you have a
Yeah.
locked-in mortgage, so you just stay on that mortgage as long as your rent covers that mortgage with a decent margin. Then you will tide through that season, and then you can come out on the other end. And that's how most of the people that survived the 2008 crisis, that's how they got through it, is because they didn't have these. Some people have this idea that you can top up your rent.
Mm.
So maybe your mortgage is 1,000, your rent is 800, and you'll be topping up £200 as you go on, because you're waiting for the capital to appreciate, and then you can make money. And I'm sure some people have made money doing that, but it's a very, very risky strategy, because if anything happens to your income or to the property, then you have no buffer. So
Mm.
I talk on my podcast about what makes a great property investment, about how you make sure that you either buy low, lock in the value, and then make sure that you are investing in a way that protects you against the downside.
At what point do you decide actually this property is now becoming a bit of a bad deal and I'm not going to weather the storm. I need to let go of this property. At what point do you decide
Hopefully, I'll never have to have that make that decision.
that?
Well, for anyone who actually is going through that, it's a valid, we're coming to a season that's tumultuous, right? So, based on the impact of the lockdown, we're talking about some people have a very bullish, bullish, optimistic view as to what's going to happen because the market is still very, very vibrant. But I guess because I started when it was not in such great times, I've seen what that can be like. So I would say that the great thing about now is that God knows there's so many strategies. When I started, honestly, I had no idea. I could have sworn there was only two strategies: buy low, sell high. That's it. Now there's lease options. There's actually within lease options, there's even different strategies that if, say, for instance, you had your negative equity, there's a way you can pass on that property to somebody else who wants to buy the property, but will first be a tenant buyer before then they become a full-time buyer. Like there's so many creative structures out there now that have kind of been borrowed from the commercial market and they've now adopted them into residential space. So, I think for most deals, if we sit down, I have, in fact, my next podcast coming out, amazing. It's with a guy who specializes in lease options. And he said, actually, with property, when he first started with property, he was thinking more of property as, oh, what can I get? What can I get? And he realized that actually the way to employ and the way to really succeed in property is, well, how can I help the other person? And so when you look at a deal, no matter how dire it seems, if we sit down and we really analyze and both of us are flexible, we can strike up some kind of arrangement that will work, that will be a win-win. And so there's so many structures that you can add on where the person either will pass it on to somebody else, for a short time while that person is maybe paying off the mortgage, maybe refurbishes the place, uplifts the value, then can sell on. There's so many strategies around property investing now that didn't exist. At least they didn't exist in my sphere when I started, but which I've come very conversant with now. So I would say that most people that have difficulties, you just need to find the right person and
Mm.
they can work out, and you have to be flexible obviously and be realistic as to your outcome. So those are the type of questions you would have, is that you find out what is your bottom line, what do you need to be able to get out of this mess you're in, and then we can start to try and make it happen. Just try and strategize and get it done.
So we've literally run out of time now. I can't believe that 1 hour has gone. But if you had one parting shot to someone who's saying, I'm not sure what to do here, what would you tell them in 30 seconds? What would you tell them?
I would say definitely get education, get a good understanding of what property is all about, start immersing yourself in that space. Property is not something you can do part time, you have to be in it. And once you start getting it, you start to understand what strategies work for you, then you can really fall in and really lean into that strategy. So you need to understand all the different property strategies that are out there and then work out which one works for you in terms of your lifestyle, in terms of your time, in terms of your budget, in terms of your know-how, your natural abilities. Once you find that strategy, then you go for it.
Thank you, thank you, thank you for your time this evening. I know you've got a
Exactly.
really busy schedule, but I really appreciate coming on the program this evening. And to our viewers, thank you so much for joining across the platforms. We will be sharing snippets on our website, tmeinsights.com, in the coming days. And you can always go back and access the resources we've got on the website. Dolapo, thank you so much for coming. And maybe I will just be on that podcast sometime soon, watching and listening to these snippets, and maybe we'll meet at a property conference sometime soon. Thank you
For
very
sure.
much. And thanks to our
Thank you.
viewers. Bye for now. See you next time.